Hello, everyone. This time I'll be sharing with you the upcoming Sunday school lesson for Sunday, September the 24th. It comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, two passages, verses 1 to 11 and verses 56 to 59. In your quarterly, the title is Jesus Prevents Two Stonings. Now, you might find this lesson title to be a bit unusual. For people who have never been to church, they might wonder what is a quote stoning. It will be hard for people today to envision someone being literally stoned to death, hurling huge rocks onto someone until they die. It sounds barbaric, and it was. Yet we kill and murder people in any number of ways today, sometimes for committing crimes, and sometimes because people are just angry or crazy or careless. In biblical times, killing was commanded for adultery. Leviticus 20 verse 10 says, quote, "If a man commits adultery with a married woman, if he commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death." And there were other instances where the death penalty would have been in place for inappropriate sexual acts and even cursing one's father or mother. It doesn't matter what we think about those standards or rules, but that's what they were in those biblical times. How stoning became a common way for carrying out the action may be unknown, perhaps because it was convenient, because stones were readily available. Ecclesiastes 3:5 says, quote, "There is a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones." But we are not sure whether that reference is to an action of stoning someone to death for crimes, or does it mean something else? Here are two other scriptures. Leviticus 20, verse 27, quote, "A man or woman who is a medium or a spiritist, meaning a witch, must be put to death. They are to be stoned. Their death is their own fault." And stoning was commanded for the death punishment of Achan, whose sin had led to the defeat of the Israelites at the place called Ai. Joshua 7:25, Joshua says, "Why have you brought us trouble? Today the Lord will bring you trouble." So all Israel stoned them, referring to Achan and his family, to death. In addition, at least two witnesses must be present, and they were to be the ones to cast the first stones, the witnesses. If these failed to produce death, the bystanders proceeded to complete the sentence, whereupon the body was to be suspended until sunset from Deuteronomy 21, verse 23. At that point, the body was to be buried. The biblical text for John 8, verses 1 through 11, probably begins with chapter 7, verse 53. There are some who question the authenticity of the text because this account is not found in the very earliest manuscripts, and you may have notes that reference that in your personal Bible, particularly if you have a study Bible. However, I personally believe this account to be true. It certainly sounds like Jesus. Here are a number of aspects to this story. First, Jesus is interrupted, verses 2 and 3. Jesus had gone to the temple courts to teach the people. Now, we believe that this is a continuation from chapter 7 and last week's lesson when Jesus had entered into Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, also called the Feast of Booths, or even the Feast of Shelters. Jesus had a receptive audience, but in the process of teaching them, Jesus was interrupted by the scribes and Pharisees. These were the rabbinic leaders who regularly questioned Jesus' authority. They brought in a woman caught in the act of adultery, making her stand in the center, which implies that the crowd was surrounding her, a crowd of Jesus' supporters, but also his non-supporters. The second aspect is Jesus is challenged. verses 4 to 6. These Jewish leaders said that the Mosaic law commanded this woman to be killed, to stone such a woman to death. As we have already seen, they were correct in their proclamation and interpretation of law. Jesus did not argue with them. To do so would have been pointless, yet Jesus had a different kind of response, a response that none of them could have expected or predicted. So the third aspect is that Jesus spoke to the spiritual heart, verses 7 to 8. And of course, Jesus always spoke to the spiritual heart. Jesus challenged them on the grounds of their own morality and sinfulness. He gave them his permission or blessing to do the stones, to throw stones, if the stone thrower was sinless. Think about that. Were they sinless? While we don't know what Jesus was writing on the ground, it has been speculated that he was writing out either their names or their sins. Who among them had ever lied or cheated or had indecent thoughts? Certainly all of them had committed sins in their mind, in their heart, or maybe by their physical actions. So apparently none of them could claim such moral superiority to actually say, I've never sinned. So there are two results. One is that the accusers walked away from the oldest to the youngest, and that's the way it was done in those days. Personally, I think the whole situation was a setup. How did they know about the sex act? And what about the man involved? The other result was that Jesus offered forgiveness to the woman. His words to her are famous. Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. Yet she was commanded to not engage in this type of sin or any sin again. Now, did she ever commit adultery again? Well, obviously we do not know. What about us? When we are forgiven of a sin, do we not do that sin again? That's the question. Are we capable of not sinning again? The second passage, before Abraham, begins in verse 33, where the religious leaders claim to be descendants of Abraham, meaning that they were among the original Jews. They have, according to them, inherited a measure of spiritual authority, which puts them above other people, even the Romans. Look at Jesus' response in verses 39 to 40. He says, quote, if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. But now you are trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God, God the Father. So Jesus was telling them many things. He was telling them that Abraham was a righteous man who obeyed God, and they were not. Their claims were inconsistent with their actions. He was also telling them that Jesus was of God and existed before Abraham. As such, Jesus glorifies the Father, and the Father glorifies the Son. And at that declaration of oneness with God, of being equal with God, of being God, they picked up stones to kill him. Yes, they picked up stones to try to kill Jesus. But Jesus just walked away, and they could do no harm to him. Jesus had no fear of them, but obviously, these scribes and Pharisees were very afraid of Jesus. In closing, I would recommend the 3 stories found on page 31 of the Learner's Guide. They're great stories. These stories speak to forgiveness and self-worth, and not just forgiving ourselves, but forgiving those who have done us harm in life. The lesson writer calls it inclusive grace. Let me pray that you will experience inclusive grace and be willing to give it to others who also need it. God bless. Have a wonderful week.